On your channel, Crecganford, you cover what I would describe as mythology. What is mythology?
That is a great question because if you ask 100 mythology stats, you'll get probably 100 answers. So, mythology is seems to be a genre under folklore, folklore being sort of the subject field, and it consists of mythology, folk tales, and legend. Some may want to put history in there, uh, and on top of narratives, it also includes perhaps things like games and customs and rituals. Okay, so I focus on narratives and narratives that tend to be considered mythology. Now, what is the difference between mythology and legend and folktale? That I've actually written a paper about on the classification of folklore. Now, it is based on three things. It's based on the authority the story or the narrative has within the society it's being told. So, if you told a joke in a bar, that has no authority. People don't give it any real meaning. But if you're a priest giving a sermon in a church, you have a lot of authority. So there's different authority levels. So things with low authority tend to be folk tales or fairy tales or general fictional stories. Things with high authority tend to either be myths or legends. Now, whether they're a myth or a legend depends on their ontological setting in time and space. If a story is told uh, in on our Earth in a historical timeline, it would tend to be legend. If it's told on a different Earth, so things like Homer's Iliad, for example, may have recognizable places in it, but those places aren't actually on this Earth because they contain things that you do not find on this Earth, such as Cyclops. So that's considered a different Earth, and it's in a prehistoric timeline. It's before we have proper written history, so that's considered mythological. Um, so, in those definitions, what I've tried to do is I've tried to remove terms like sacredness and the like, which are usually applied to mythology. I think narrative authority um, takes care of that. It can encompass sacred stories, but it can also encompass other stories that are considered important to a society that aren't necessarily sacred. And that's what my paper actually covers. So stories change depending on who's telling them, who's listening to them, and over time, what happens to society and the importance of it. So that's in a nutshell what mythology is.
Some people will, I think, attempt to describe mythology as a sort of like, well, Norse mythology is the religion that the Norse followed, like
Correct.
Roman mythology is the religion. But I've always found that interesting because specifically the word religion from Latin religio means like a discipline. Like it means like things that you do, like a way that you carry out your life, as opposed to a set of things you believe. Do you think that religion and mythology should be appropriated?
I believe that religious stories told to people who believe that religion have a high narrative authority and so become myth. But today, if you told me a religious story, maybe about Zeus doing something, it would have no narrative authority. It wouldn't be religious, or it would be religious historically, but not religious to us. It'd have no value. So that's why I have this definition of authority and ontological setting, because it really does depend on who's telling me the story and who's listening. So the religious aspect is down to that. Who is the audience? So if you have a story, you should note the audience, and then you can understand if it is religious, and if it is therefore mythology. So that's how I would look at it. But you do find many religious texts can be defined as mythological texts, depending on the audience you're talking about when you're defining it.
I do wonder, I don't want us to get too sidetracked early on, but I've often thought, nowadays, if you were to take, for example, a Roman Catholic and ask them, what do you believe? they could point to you to an actual book, like the Catechism of the Roman Catholic Church, and say like, I believe everything in here. Maybe they don't actually agree with it all, but they could point you to that, something like that. And if you were to say, do you believe X point? They would say, well, because I'm X religion, I do. But when I compare that to when I'm reading, for example, the writings of the Romans, it seems like they have a very nebulous, in comparison at least, relationship to the things that they believe. Sometimes I even wonder whether or not they believed them at all. What do you think about the sort of comparison between, this sort of stretches over a few millennia, but
Yes, there's a really good article by, or I think it's a chapter in Bruce Lincoln's book, Theorizing Myth, where he talks about mythos and logos in Greek and the difference between those. And then he
mhm,
says when these go to Rome, they actually called it fabulae. By that point, the actual belief in them, as you rightly say, sort of disappeared. It's a story
yeah,
for
like
the sake of
fables.
culture, yes,
Uh-huh.
rather than um, has it's got narrative authority for the fact it has heritage, and,
I
and
see.
a sort of more nationalist belief in a way. And that happens to many stories and religions. People grasp onto them as, well, these stories are Roman, or these stories are Old Norse, or these stories are British, or whatever. And people hold on to them really for the not the original reasons they were created. So yes, that does happen, and it also happens, as I say, when science comes along, because religion is science in the absence of science.
Huh. Well, then, do you believe that, let's say he exists, that Homer, believed in the existence of Zeus and, the other gods?
I believe there, as much as people today believe in God.
Okay,
So
interesting.
it
Yeah.
isn't a binary answer. It's a sort of yes, no. There are some people who aren't Christian and yet still think God exists. Something must have created the universe. So there's
Hmm.
probably some unknown things going on that need to be explained. And for want of a better solution, Zeus seems to be a good answer.
Hmm. Well, speaking of Zeus, today I would like to really talk a lot about the sort of Proto-Indo-European pantheon, and the sort of, the stories and the myths that you talk a lot about on your channel relating to this sort of diaspora of the sort of the Indo-European group. But how do we begin to sort of construct a pantheon for, a people that we have no texts from?
That is another good question, and this goes down to what is Indo-European, because this
Mhm.
is a yes,
That's a great question.
two words that have been misused many times. So Indo-European is a language family. So we
Mhm.
tend to refer to Indo-Europeans as people who speak a language from that language family. Now, what is interesting about it and the clues in the name is that this language family is really rather vast and is probably one of the major language families in the world. What it is, it covers about 40 to 45%, I think, of the world's population will speak an Indo-European language.
Mhm.
So if all these people are speaking a language that seems to be similar, how are they related? And our most probable answer is that they came from a single language where people migrated and, in effect, dispersed with that language. Okay. Um, and the source of those people are known as the Indo-Europeans. They have a culture associated with them, tend to be called Yamnaya. And the Yamnaya people would have spoken originally a language called Proto-Indo-European, so a pre-Indo-European language. It is, as you say, hypothetical, but there again, I argue with people. So is speaking before the phonograph, because you have no proof people made any sounds, before the 19th century, really. So,
Yeah.
or nobody told stories before writing. Let's have a bit of logic here. Of course, these things were people were speaking, and so providing you accept that hypothesis that the language spread from a source, and that source culture, say we call the Amnaya, although they probably weren't the first people speaking Proto-Indo-European, there were cultures coming up, building into the Yamnaya. Then those people who took that language and spread it because they were speaking the same language, they probably had similar stories and similar beliefs. And therefore, when you look at the Indo-European family landscape and look at the stories being told in it about religion, religions that are now no longer really supported, from Roman and to a degree Greek, but Old Norse and Germanic and Persian, Iranian, and the Vedic or Northwest India, we see commonalities in those religious stories, which again should give us confidence that actually something spread. And so, what we can do is by looking at those old religious stories, such as the Vedic culture, to a degree Zoroastrianism, but we have some older texts from pre-Zoroastrian texts. We look in Roman texts and say Old Norse and Germanic. We can see patterns, and by looking at those patterns, we can try to, and I'm going to use another word Bruce Lincoln uses, scientific or academically construct a pantheon. It's
Mhm.
not, we could argue it's reconstruction, but we're not really putting things back to as a source in a way. We're using the hypothesis of this Proto-Indo-European language to try and create the names, and but we're looking at the gods that exist in these other religions to create that pantheon. So
Mhm.
it is probably more strictly a construction rather than a reconstruction. But in doing that, we find a pantheon that seems to fit quite well. And that pantheon, some people may be familiar with some of the figures in it. There is a sky father god, a Deus Vita, or you may be able to pronounce it far better than I. Um, there is Degamata, his wife. We have, in fact, Perkinos, a storm god. Don't know what that would be his precise Proto-Indo-European name. And then we have a number of other gods that appear and disappear over time. So it isn't like you can take a snapshot of the pantheon, let's say at 3,500 BC, and say this is the pantheon, because at 3,000 BC it may have changed, and at 4,000 BC it may have changed. And this is the thing with any religion or story. It's always adapting, always changing. So for someone to say, this is the pantheon, you need them to say, well, the pantheon where and when. A bit like the ontological setting we find in the trying to classify a story of folklore. You need to be a bit precise to have it. But within the other things within that, there are other suns, there are divine twins, there are fates, there are goddesses of the night, there are people who, or figures that control water or cattle, because pastoral farming was very key. So we build up this pantheon that we call, the Proto-Indo-European pantheon. But it is always up for discussion and debate. So there is no right answer because of the timeframes we're talking about.
I remember when I was first reading Latin, like as a student, and we were reading the plays of Plautus, who's one of the earlier Latin playwrights. He's one of the earliest sources of Latin we have in general, and all of the characters, in sort of more classical Roman Golden Latin, they would say like, "Oh Jupiter," they would say like, "Oh Jupiter," but in Plautus they say, "Oh dies Piter." And I was always taught like, oh, that's just like another way to refer to Jupiter. And, for me as a sort of lazy undergrad, it was just annoying that I had to memorize another thing. But now looking back, like that is one of the coolest bits of like linguistic residue that I could have possibly seen. And I just kind of happened to see it in a random play. I can't
And you
get
get
over
that
how
with
cool that
Zeus
is.
as well. And
Hmm.
Zeus was called Zeus Pater. And in fact, we see Zeus called Zeus Perkinus as he
Hmm.
acquires the lightning bolt of the storm god. And then that's dropped, and then Zeus becomes the almighty supreme god, and not only a sky father, but a sky father and a storm god in one. And Greek's fantastic. It's whilst it's considered an Indo-European family group, it has so much Neolithic farming culture still within it that persisted. It's a real mess for a mythologist to look at, and I try to avoid it because it is so messy. But it's really interesting at the same time that you can get these fingerprints of older cultures underneath the Indo-European culture. So, for example,
Yeah.
the creation myth of the Greeks is Neolithic farming. It is not an Indo-European creation myth, where
Uh-huh.
Rome, Old Norse, German, Iran, India, Indo-European creation myth.
Uh-huh.
So Greeks have persisted.
Yeah, while we're on the subject, so the Greek sort of Proto-Indo-European Greeks, maybe Proto-Greeks come in, but there are already people living there.
Absolutely.
To my understanding, this is about 10,000 years ago. Correct me if I'm wrong.
Yes. Yeah, that's when farming was knocking on the door of Greece. Yeah, the Anatolian
Okay.
farmers were coming across.
But we have vestiges of the sort of pre-Indo-European culture that was in Greece.
Absolutely, absolutely. So if you look at their creation myth, where they have Uranus and Gaia, and
Hmm.
they have children, and the children, there's like patricide and matricide and incest and all sorts of things going on before Zeus becomes the supreme god. In effect, yeah, there's
Hmm.
yeah, and you get these stories to give a sense of credibility to Zeus. Well, that is the story you see in Hittites. That's the story you see in the Philo-Biblos. That's the story we see in the creation myth of Dune, which is Near Eastern. We see it in the Enuma Elish. That story, that creation myth has come from the Near East and travelled with farming into Greece.
Ah, I see. Okay, interesting. Huh.
So you have this same thing going on in the matricide and patricide to create a supreme being.
Yeah, okay, that makes sense. On the figure of Zeus, though, to get sort of back on my
Sorry,
mental
yes.
path. Yeah. So he, I think, is the most famous example of our ability to reconstruct or construct, an Indo-European god. I think most children who learn Greek and Roman mythology can make the connection that Zeus and Jupiter are the same. But what else is there outside of those two cultures?
Now, those two cultures, you have Tyr. So, but most people think the chief god of the Old Norse and Germans is Odin or Woden, but before him, it was Tiwaz or Tyr,
Mhm.
which is a deus. There is in Iranian, you have Gao-Martan, or Gaomart, which Gao reduces to Gemo, reduces to Yemo, which is sort of well, that's a primordial god, but we can see going back. I'm just trying to get Sky Fathers. You have Vedic Dyaspita,
Mhm.
which he eventually changes into Indra, and we see a lot of this. We see a lot of the Sky Father, where we see some agricultural influence turn into the storm god as well. So his storm god, some we usually see. So Indra becomes chief god. That's not unusual. In Greece, again, it isn't like that because Heracles has all the properties of a storm god, apart from being he isn't a god, but he looks like he does the same myths, the same stories as a storm god, but he just has can't cast thunder and lightning everywhere. So they're the key ones. Uh, so yes, the we do have fingerprints of the gods, so to speak, um, in there with regards to the Sky Father, but that also persists in other key Indo-European figures as well. So Yemo is the big one. So I can sort of go off kilt for a second. So
Yeah, of
in
course.
the Indo-European creation myth, there are two primordial figures that create the world and the gods, including Despota, the Sky Father. And these figures are called Manu and Yemo. Manu means man, and Yemo means twin. These are twins, and we see Manu and Yemo cropping up
Mhm.
uh, all over the shop in Vedic
Emo has to
Germania.
be where Gemini comes from, no?
Yeah, exactly. It's where
Okay,
Trisco comes from, where
gotcha.
Ymir comes from in Old Norse, which probably
Mm.
means twin or two. We got Twisco in Tacitus, Germania. Twisco probably means twin or two. Although I think it's actually not Twisco. I think it's something like Kisco or something, but that's just a phonetic change as we see. But we see other gods as well dotted around, where we see fingerprints. And in the Greek pantheon, it is their Degamata, which is the
Yeah.
sort of key mother goddess, goes to Demeter. So she's in the Greek pantheon, but again, demoted. So there's all sorts of things that have gone in the Greek pantheon that I would love to have a timeline of how these things shift around.
Mhm.
But there's obviously a coming together of pantheons there, and stories have been made up and changed to again give a sense of credibility to why the pantheon looks as it does.
Mhm. In one of your videos, I remember you suggesting that Demeter, the Greek goddess, might have not, at least her figure in Greek mythology may have been actually a pre-Indo-European figure that was sort of subsumed into the Greek pantheon.
Mhm.
Am I to understand, however, that her name is still
Sisters,
very
yes.
Indo-European? Okay.
Yes. So, yeah, and I think that perhaps happens to a number of figures. Say Greece is really hard to follow that in. Old Norse is really interesting because that's similar in a way. So people think Old Norse uh, is uh, is very much Indo-European in how it's set
Hmm.
up, but it isn't. We can talk about this later, but the stories of Balder, absolutely Neolithic farming. Um,
Interesting.
Freya with her cat chariot, cats definitely Neolithic farming, like Near East. So you've got these things in there, and they're in Germanic, like so in Saxo Grammaticus's work as well. There's a story of Balder, so that's definitely worth covering a bit later on.
Mhm.
But they absolutely, we see it all over the place. So it's really important that when we're looking at these, the Indo-European language family and the culture it's brought around, that we understand that it isn't one thing. We can't take a snapshot and say this is it. All of it's changed all over the place to be influenced by other cultures. So it's hard to say this is Indo-European.
One thing I wanted to say as regards to the Skyfather thing is I've always found it funny that when the English sort of adopted the Roman calendar structure and we called Dies Iovis Thursday, but
Mm.
then Dies Martis, we called that Tuesday, where if they had really studied their comparative linguistics, they would have known that Dies Iovis really should have been Tuesday because that's the actual linguistic cognate. But they replaced it with Thor
Mm.
because Thor is like so, storm god coded, for lack of a better word. I think in your videos you've even mentioned him as a sort of storm god figure. Is he?
Yeah, well, he's more of a sky god, I would say.
Sky
But
god, yeah.
what you'll find, I know you've spoken to Jackson Crawford. If you spoke to him, he would be a little irked by that because gods are personalities. The fact we try to label with them with their specialist subject uh, is just our doing to try and give them some pattern we can
Right,
recognise.
right.
But really, Thor is I'd like to consider him as a, a fine best friend. He'll stand up for you in a fight. He'll win
Hmm.
battles. You admire what he does in terms of the very patriarchal culture. But because of how he works and acts, he is far more of a Deus Vita figure than
Hmm.
uh, Odin, for example, because Odin has nothing to do with the old Norse pantheon sort of before maybe 2,500 years ago. Nowhere to be seen. He comes
Yeah.
in externally, which is again a very interesting story, depending on whose theories you want to believe on how that happened.
And it seems like they knew that, honestly, because he's always equated not with Jupiter, but with Mercury,
Mm.
in
Yes,
all the Latin sources, including our
exactly.
days of the week. Dies Mercurius, Mercurii gets replaced by Wednesday,
Yes,
Wednesday.
and I think
Um,
that's more to do with his looks than what
what do you
his
think?
properties. So I believe that when Tacitus is writing this and writing these analogues, in effect, or was the Romano Interpretatio, he he's not necessarily doing that himself. He's relying on probably third parties to come back with some information. I'm
Right.
not overly sure, uh, and the easiest thing to do is look at something and see what it looks like. And if the god has ravens and he's perhaps wearing a hat, what god in the Roman pantheon has ravens and wears a hat? And it was
Right.
probably
Yeah.
as simple as that. That he's not overly thinking it.
Yeah. Although I do think there is something interesting there to the sort of shape-shifting nature as well.
Yes, yes, but all sort of gods could shapeshift in a way.
That's true. That's
Yeah,
true. Okay, well, so we've got the Dies Pater Father figure, this sort of Sky Father figure, the Degum Mater, sort of Earth Mother. Is that sort of how we could
yes,
translate that?
yeah.
And then I'm sure there are plenty others. Dawn Goddess is one that gets thrown around a lot as well.
Indeed. So yes, the dawn goddess. So um yeah, so we have this, I think it's Husus figure, and we sometimes see this connected in a way with Esoter. You probably made videos about
Oh,
Esoter,
Eostre, the sort of Old
Eostre,
English goddess.
Eostre.
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
Yes, yeah, and I am certainly of the belief that she was not a major god, and I think we
Yeah.
have the Romans to blame a lot for this. They've taken maybe even localized gods and over sort of push them in societies, and we pick up little bits of
Mhm.
text and think, oh, this what was a small god living in the woodland of a sort of a pre-Roman settlement has suddenly turned into this major regional god. So we have to be careful how we do things like that. So yes, there
Mhm.
is a dawn god. The coming of the sun is very important in both the Neolithic farming and Indo-European cultures. Because once the sun disappears and you know, Niktos, the god of the night, turns up, because you must forget in it's our belief that people back then thought that darkness was emitted. So darkness isn't the
Interesting.
absence of the sun. Darkness is like you could buy a night light bulb at your local store, plug it in, and everything becomes dark. Um,
Mhm.
so there was a real balance between night and day in that respect. So it's really important that the sun was lit up and shine upon the world. So
Interesting.
I think we don't necessarily get the dawn goddess enough. She's well attested to, so we know she's there. But
Mhm.
in terms of actually her power, is interesting. We see stories of the gates of the underworld opened up so she can come out during the day, and so there's some myth there. But it is I don't think we know enough about her to understand what her sort of power was, apart from she just represented the sun being able to come up to start the day, which you say is
Mhm.
quite important if you're human.
Well, you've mentioned the creation story already. This might be the answer to that, to the question I'm about to ask, but what are our sort of most confidently reconstructed or attested myths in the Indo-European sphere?
So absolutely, the creation myth, their cosmogony is well attested to, and because of that, we have some really good insights into how they lived and thought of things and acted and behaved. So that's really interesting.
Yeah, I'd love for you to elaborate on that.
Okay, so well, I can tell the creation myth for those who don't know it. This construction, okay, because this would be quite important when we go elsewhere. So the creation myth basically says in the beginning there is nothing, and then two twins, primordial twins, turn up, Manu and Jimo, uh, normally with a cow. And the cow's important uh, because the Indo-Europeans were pastoral farmers. And I can explain more about the cow in a minute as well. And what happens is that in the story, depending on where you are, either Manu sacrifices Yimo, or he sacrifices the cow and creates the world from that. And what you find is that Manu comes to the world often as a priest figure, and Yimo is representative of a king, and often becomes the king of the underworld. And the cow is then used to represent the creation of animals on the world. And what is really interesting is that Manu, the priest who has sacrificed, let's say, his brother Yimo, builds the world from Yimo's body, and we get these homologies. So bones are rocks, flesh is the soil, hair is grass, blood is the sea. We get these. And then we also see that from the head, Manu, the priest, builds the first king. From the torso, he builds the first warriors. And from the legs, he builds the providers or the farmers or the people of the land. Um,
Interesting.
but the building of the king actually encompasses not just the head, because he builds priests from the head as well, but he also, in if we've constructed this right, but also uses part of the torso and the legs. So in effect, the king has parts of the body from all people. So the king should understand all people. But
Mhm.
what is interesting then is that because the king perhaps contains parts of the head, the torso, and the legs, as does the world, because the world is built from the whole body. Then the king and the land are one. So if the king becomes ill, the land often is thought to be becoming ill, and if the land is ill, people think the king are ill. And this didn't bode well for any kings in Indo-European cultures.
Right.
Certainly, if
Yeah.
you lost an arm, and there's lots of stories of warriors and kings losing arms or body parts, especially in Old Norse,
Mhm.
everybody's losing bits of their body. Um, it just suggests that things aren't right. Uh, but that's the gist of it. That the homologies are
Mhm.
really important because you see them time and again in various texts, even in biblical texts, such as Enoch. Second Enoch, I think, has Jesus being built in the same way,
Mhm.
where the rocks become his bones and the sea becomes his blood. So he's created like that.
Kind of reminds
Um,
me of, I think it was Plato, if I'm not mistaken, who wanted the king to spend a long time in different classes before he became king in order to kind of like know what the people felt. And I've always thought that that was kind of a remarkable thing to say in, a couple centuries BC. But I wonder, I mean,
yeah,
it's obviously
exactly,
speculative, but I wonder if that's kind of where he gets that idea from hearing stories
exactly,
like that.
exactly. And then what you find is that when these characters appear in battles, or whatever, warriors tend to be struck in the torso. Kings
Mm.
tend to lose their heads,
I
and no one
see.
really
Yeah.
worries what happens to providers. But, well, that's no one writes
Yeah.
stories about that. Um, so I'm not being horrible to them. That's just the truth. It's
Uh-huh.
so yeah, but there's a real link between the body and the world. So and because of that, we can understand things like medicine. So we see that um, if you were going bald, there are actually charms to fix your baldness by putting a special plant on your head, because
Mhm.
Yemo's hair became the
Oh,
plants. So by
right.
reverse, if you get plants, you can put it on your head and you can get hair. Or indeed, why is the sea salty? Because uh, because if what you do is when you're ill, you extract the badness and put it into the rivers, and the rivers will float off, and it'll all the badness will come together, and that's why the sea tastes awful, because
Ah,
you've
interesting.
extracted the illness. So they use this sort of cosmogony to really make a good picture of the world. I can understand how it could make sense to people who don't have science, because they've got this real good balance in there. And perhaps most interestingly of all is sacrifice and human sacrifice. Uh, but I'll use a bovine in this instance,
Mhm.
because one is more pleasant, but two, it'll explain the importance of bovines. So the Indo-Europeans were pastoral farmers. They because the landscape was more suited to having cattle than making fields and farming. And plus, with the invention of the wheel, or the use of the wheel in wagons, and the domestication of horses, eventually they could travel with their cattle around the land, and that together just made the Indo-Europeans, the Yamnai culture, spread out rather rapidly. So cows were important, but also because they must have been gifts from the gods, because they were perfect animals. Every part of a cow could be used. Its hide for clothes, its bones for tools, its flesh you could eat. Urine was a disinfectant, manure, or the use of fertilizer. You could even drink its baby's food, the milk. Um,
Yeah.
the cow was just the perfect animal. And so if well, there's stories about dragons and cattle, which we can go into. But for now, if they needed more cattle, they would sacrifice a cattle. So they choose a best bovine, and as part of the sacrifice, we're pretty sure, because we have clues in some texts, that they would tell the creation myth as they're carving up the body, and they're
Mm.
passing out the meat. So the king gets the head, the warriors get parts of the torso, and then the sort of the farmers and the land providers will get parts of the leg. So there
Mm.
is this still tier system, but by reenacting the sacrifice, you are reinforcing the cosmogony, and the creation myth, and people know it, and that's how these stories persist. This ritualized behavior of myth telling, because people sometimes forget that stories, old stories, we didn't read them because we didn't have writing. Our oldest stories people told, they were often told almost certainly as poetry or song, because that's
Mhm.
far easier to remember. And they were told with performance, because again, that's easier to remember and easier to do. So many of our greatest stories that have survived, I would argue, were probably originally told in the oral tradition as poetry, ritualized and formed.
Mhm.
And so we see
What
that.
kind
So
of go ahead, sorry.
no, no, think after you.
I was just going to ask, what kind of, so we have the creation myth.
Mhm.
If you sort of were able to, if someone was, on an elevator with you and asked what what's like a high profile story shared among Indo-European cultures besides the creation myth, is there one that comes to mind? Is there one that's like
Yes.
particularly interesting?
The cattle raiding myth. So the
Oh,
cattle
interesting.
raiding myth. So because the bovine is a gift from God, no one else other than your culture should have cows. If they've had cows, they must have stolen them because your God wouldn't have given someone you don't like the cattle. That was
Uh-huh.
that was the logic. So they create this story about how a dragon has stolen the cattle, and then warriors have to go out to get the cattle back. And this is really interesting for so many reasons. The first off is that a short history of dragons. I'll take a short detour. I'll do this very
For
quickly.
sure, yeah.
Dragons, our oldest dragon stories tend to have dragons as benevolent, uh, water-giving creatures that create the earth, create the rivers and the valleys, and make it rain and plants grow, people grow, and they were excellent. We love dragons. Uh, we then find by the time farming comes along and people have crops and they want it to rain and it's not raining, who do they blame? Well, the dragons, because the dragons should be giving them water. So how do they get the dragon to give them water? They create a storm god to go into the clouds, fight the dragon, makes a lot of noise, thunder and lightning, and boom, it rains. And hey, their storm god has defeated the dragon. They get water. Now, if you're in a society that has grown from that, as the Indo-Europeans have significant influence from the Neolithic farming cultures, as well as the hunter-gatherers, Caucasus and
Mhm.
Eastern hunter-gatherers, what does their story do? Well, they've got cattle. So the dragon isn't withholding rain, it's withholding the cattle. So you just see a reappropriation of the story, but for the landscape and the society. So this is how stories change. The crux remains the same, but the details change, so it's relevant. And so they create a story where their chief warrior, they call Trito, which means three in Proto-Indo-European. So you have the Manu, first man, Ymir, the second, Trito, the third, the warrior. He uh, creates a ritual, often gives something to the storm god. The storm god gives him strength, and Trito goes off to a place beyond the boundaries of the land, which is a very familiar type of story where if you want to kill a dragon, in fact, all dragon slaying tends to happen in a place no human can go to. It happens deep in the sea or in the mountains or in the clouds. So he goes off to the mountains, apparently kills a dragon and comes back with cattle. In likelihood, if that did happen in real life, they'd probably just stole cattle from someone else. No dragons to be slain. Uh, but yes, and that comes back, and that is the cattle raiding myth. Now we see lots of dragon slaying, um, well, which almost ubiquitous across the world. But with cattle, it tends to be more Indo-European focused. But we do see these stories not only in Greece. You may be familiar with some of the stories. We see it in Iran. We see it in India. We also actually start seeing it go down into the Near East in David and the Philistines in the Bible, and we see it in some of the cultures in Africa. I think it's called Danku culture as well. So it's a very popular myth, and it seems to have become quite widely well spread. As the Indo-Europeans become more influential and start trading with the Near East and beyond. So that is, yeah, an incredibly interesting myth. And if you want to take the dragon myth further, just for completeness, as writing comes in, I think we start seeing and the stories of poetry. when you write a story or a poem about dragon slaying, you don't tend to say, "Oh, Trito slaughter the dragon." You create metaphor, make it beautiful, and make it rhyme to fit a meter. Okay, so with metaphors and like being used, we see in Iran, I think the term is Danu, which means she who lactates. Cows are called that. So the dragon takes the Danu. But when it gets to the Vedic culture, Danu is it goes to I think it's Danu, which means women who lactate or something. It can mean cows, but it can also mean queens. And in the Vedic culture, the dragon story goes from the dragon cattle raiding to the dragon stealing queens.
I
And
see.
then I believe the Greeks come along and twist it a bit. And a few hundred years later in Central Europe, or well, probably 1,000 years later, medieval Europe, you have dragons stealing princesses.
I
And
see.
that is
Interesting.
possibly why dragons started stealing princesses rather than cattle.
What do you say to people who sort of look at all the things you're saying and say, it's just coincidental?
Absolutely. So get this a lot. Um, I would say the work I do isn't absolute. So, for people who don't know what I do, I'm a comparative mythologist. We compare stories and try and find similarities and see if we can trace back to an early version of it. We can't necessarily, well, we probably could never get to the very first version of a story, but we can try and get as close as we can because stories adapt and change even in the beginning. So there's multiple versions within. Yes. So what we do is we look at this. We've got lots of good data from historical migration data, geodetics, archaeology, linguistic evolution. And by using all these, with looking at the stories and how the contents develop and change, uh, we can come up with a probability of where a story possibly came from. And if you've got enough data, you can trace it back to places. And so everything I'm saying today is probabilistic, is a statistical sort of answer associated with it. But I would also say the probabilities are such that no other answer can explain it more confidently. So people could say, oh, perhaps it's a Jungian archetype, which irks me somewhat. That's a whole different video. Uh, and yes, it could be. It could be. The Indo-European language could just be lucky that all these different regions just suddenly started speaking a related language.
Yeah.
Or so it's probabilities, um, and that's what my channel is about. Really trying to talk about this and discussing it without going too heavy in the math.
Well, I think what comes to mind is when I'm trying to defend comparative linguistics as a sort of real science of philology, I can I can say like, what is science? Science is when you can sort of run an experiment and have an hypothesis and sort of test things, and the more you test, the more accurate results and the more confident you get about your theories.
Mhm.
And I can demonstrate this in historical linguistics by saying, you can cover a page on a sort of etymological tree, and I can theorize, like, okay, based on what I know about sound changes, this point will become this. And if you lift your hand up and I was right, then that, helps to reinforce that theory. I've had this happen accidentally before. Um, I noticed there was a Old English word for none that I thought we had lost, and it was minechenu. And I said, well, if this had survived into modern English, we would call them minchins. And then someone responded to me, that is what we call nuns in my town in England. So it's like, wow, like that's a great sort of, what's the word? It confirms my
Yes,
hypotheses. Do
absolutely.
you think that there's a sort of comparative side, like what would you say then in a,
Yes,
in a sort of
in a
similar vein for
way.
comparative pathology?
So the problem we have is some of the narrative data. So
Hmm.
our big problem is that we have to rely generally on narrative data that has been collected in prehistory, and we have, and that hasn't always been collected in good faith or reliably written down.
Hmm.
So that can cause problems. But when we're dealing with Indo-European example, we have religious texts. So we can say, like, looking at all these religious texts and these stories, we will break these down. We call them into mythemes. So we can break a story down into its smallest component part, and that part tends to be an action of some kind, and we try to put it in a language that will not be corrupted through translation or cultural diffusion. So,
Mhm.
a good example of this is, let's say, we had a story where it rained hard. The story in England might be, oh, it was raining cats and dogs.
Mhm.
Uh, but if we try to compare that to a French story, they may say, oh, it's raining ropes. That's how they say an equivalent. So that they would never match. So we have to make sure that when we break a story down and we see these little actions, we convert them into sort of as simple, uncorruptible English as possible.
Yeah, okay.
And then we do that for multiple stories. And then we basically say, compare all these myth themes across all these stories, which match and which don't. And then when you get those and you know what stories are similar, you can map them on a map or put them on a map. And then you can say, what do we know about human dispersal? What do we know about archaeological record? What do these stories contain that give us a clue on its age? And we also know that certain stories evolve in a certain way, such as language does. So, stories will tend to maybe start with spirits and then animals and then humans, but rarely does a story have humans and then evolve into a story about animals.
Mhm.
So we can see if figures change and that we can start making clue the story went in a particular direction. And yes, by understanding the stories, you do better comparisons. But there is that narrative data which is a struggle. And not only that, the creation of the myth themes, because they are words, it can be really inconsistent. If you have more than one person doing it, you'll have some inconsistency. If you have one person doing it with tens of books, you will get inconsistency. So one of the big things I'm currently working on is trying to create a more consistent, automated way using some of the new tools we have with AI to analyze text to try and pull out myth themes in say in a consistent way. Because if you can do that and you have a library of myth themes for every story we have, then comparative mythology can be done in a press of a button, in effect.
I see.
It's a bit more complicated than that, but that's the plan.
Mhm. You know, someone who I think would have been he might not have been happy about it, but would have been very interested in your work is Jakob Grimm, who,
Oh, right,
along with
yes.
many of his brother and many of his contemporaries, as you know, were sort of obsessed with reconstructing this sort of mythology of like Germanic culture. What do you think about those efforts of that time?
Uh, the antiquarians, because the history of folklore is very interesting. Uh, it's full of, as I sort of just mentioned about narrative recording, it's corrupt data sets, for want of a
Mhm.
nicer way to put it. So, some of our great stories we consider to be folklore basically came from antiquarians talking to their wives who had been speaking to the gardener who told them a story. There wasn't
Mhm.
necessarily much going on. And then we have the likes of Fraser, who wrote a book called The Golden Bough. And he started off writing a couple of volumes. And then after a few years, he had 12 volumes and ended up believing his own theories as being factually correct. So by the end of it, it's absolute, I wouldn't say nonsense, but you certainly would never quote from it if you're doing any folklore studies, apart from writing about the history of folklore. The same
Yeah.
with Joseph Campbell's work on A Hero with a Thousand Faces, another well-known book. Again, he used a biased data set, tried to fit the data to match his outcome.
Mhm.
So there was lots of problems in the past in folklore. It is and that's the trouble with dealing with words. Words can be interpreted in different ways, translated in different ways. So that is a fundamental problem. So the Grimm's work was good because it's really one of the first times someone seriously went down and tried to write a record of the folklore of the time,
Mhm.
so the narrative folklore. So absolutely good, and they had their linguistic work alongside that to help with that, known as Grimm's law, as you're probably more than familiar with. So yes, in terms of progressing the history of folklore and the study, they were very key. But say even till more recent years, even in my lifetime, folklore is still maturing. I would say. That might upset some folklorists. But if they can't even decide what folklore is, I'm quite happy to throw something else in the mix. Yeah, so yes, the Grimm's are important, but we have to be careful if you buy it. If you like old stories and you buy an old book from eBay saying, oh, the old folk tales, be rest assured there's a very good chance they're not old folk tales, or they've been misrepresented, or they've been made up, or
Right.
they're just not what they say they are on the tin. And that is
Mhm.
a problem.
One area of mythology that I think often gets misrepresented is the sort of creatures, the sort of semi-human creatures that feature. Someone who, reads a couple children's books and plays a few video games might be able to tell you, like, well, the Norse slash Anglo-Saxon tradition has elves and dwarves. The Roman slash Greek tradition has like satyrs, fauns, and centaurs. Is that sort of like, where does that come from? Because part of it is truthful, like elves and dwarves do get mentioned in sort of Norse and sort of Anglo-Saxon sources. Why do we have such different sort of creatures, though, in different sort of groups of cultures?
Okay, so there's two ways of dealing with this. The first is through interpretation gone wrong. So we talked about Romano Interpretatio and
Mhm.
how Romans looked at things. And so we could take, a maybe a river god in England, and Romans come along, see it, a river by a town, and then create a spring god like that. Then it's happened in Bath in England, and then suddenly people think, oh, there was a Anglo-Saxon god called this. Well, no, there's probably a localized god called that. So you've taken this small god, so to speak, and you've elevated up through mistranslation and misrepresentation, which happens, all the time. As I say, especially in antiquarian folklore collection, but we see it in history. But equally, I have a friend, Sturla Ellingwag, who has just published a book which I helped him translate into English about 12,000 years of Viking history. And in there, he talks about elves and dwarves. And his view is that these are probably names for people from particular areas that had particular skills. So
Interesting.
people known as dwarves were very good iron workers and miners. Uh, People from elves, there's actually, I think there's a valley called Alfenheim or something in Norway, where people from there may have come from there. And he's saying that, perhaps they may have had a slightly different look. Maybe they had the dark hair rather than light hair or something. And these things just gave them a almost like a slang term, or perhaps even a derogatory term, depending on how you want to look at it.
Mm.
So that's where it is. And then also we have the thing where many of these creatures, certainly in folk tales, are from fairyland. So basically anything from fairyland is a fairy, and then you just have different races or species of fairies. I don't know how you'd call it. I guess.
Yeah, species,
Yes, so
genuses.
they all come from there. And so if you think there are folk tales from fairyland, they are literally just made up to explain why things go bump in the night or things go missing. I mean, if you've
Mm.
lost your car keys, you probably think you've misplaced them, but chances are you could have a sprite in your house that wants to play a trick on you. I mean, that's all
That's
they
true.
really are.
I think that actually does happen to me semi-frequently.
yes, yes.
Do
When
you
you have a
think that
misplaced
you've
keys.
Would you say that you've learned anything about like human nature while studying all of these stories?
Absolutely, absolutely. I'm not religious at all. I
Mm.
have no sort of beliefs like that, but you can't help but feel some kind of connection with the life. So I have a data source, a database called Folklore Database, and
Right, that was going to be my next
I'd say,
question if you want to talk
yeah,
about
we can we
it.
can we can talk about that in a minute. And probably half the queries I get are from social sciences who want to understand how people lived and things like that. So it tells you a lot about people's lives. And I say the stories we get tell you a lot about what's going on. And there's a chap called, I think it's Calvert Watkins, who wrote a book, How to Kill a Dragon, if I remember rightly. And he tries
I
to
think I've read it
reconstruct
actually.
poetry, Indo-European poetry, and comes up with the line, fame does not decay. He says that was a poetic line used a lot. And this is something we see in the Fates and certainly in more European traditions is this sort of patriarchal warrior figure that will just fight and fight because is not due to die until the day it's fated to die. So there's no point being at home having a cup of tea. There's a big battle on. Why are you going to die? Because you're going to die when you're going to die. You know, not
Mhm.
because you're in a battle that day. If it hasn't been fated, you're fine. And so they created a thing called Fame Does Not Decay, in effect, saying that if you died and you did great things, people would remember you. People would sing songs about you, and you hear folklore and things about that. You know, if someone dies, you know, say raise a glass and sing a song about them. You know, that's how they're remembered. You had was it Hemingway who said, or maybe wrong here, who said you die twice. Die once when you die, and once when your name is not mentioned anymore.
That was Boethius, actually.
Boethius was it? Oh
Hemingway
well,
might have
thank you.
stolen it from him, but
Oh well,
Boethius was
pesky
the first
Hemingway
person to
goes in
say
there. Yeah, yeah.
it.
So yes, but and I think that was something. So such a thing that if you wanted to be remembered, you would do good things.
Mhm.
I think is a really powerful message, and it's just true today as ever. However, social media sort of somewhat diluted this fame thing somewhat, awfully so. Uh, but yes, that to me that meant a lot, and also understanding nature. So this cosmogony I talk about in Indo-European, where this Emo was sacrificed to build the world. Well, when people were born, it was felt that the baby came out of the earth and well, not came out of it, but took Earth's resources when it was born. So soil became its flesh, the sea would become its blood, rocks, bones, and so it would consume material from the earth. So
Mhm.
sometimes you would make sacrifice to feed the earth again to keep it going. So if the earth was ill, you make sacrifice to it because the blood would go to the water, the air would go to the plants, and so on and so forth. You had this cycle. And I feel, not that I'm recommending we sacrifice people, not at all, but what I would recommend, or I'd like the idea that they considered the cosmos must have a balance. That you know you look after nature and nature looks after you. In effect, and I feel those two things together, you know, are really strong themes to think about even today.
Well, I would be remiss if I didn't ask about the folklore database, which you just mentioned. What is that?
So it's a repository of several 100,000 narratives, and these are mapped against traditions and countries and allow you to search for a word semantically or literally or phrase, and it will show you all the stories that contain that and their dispersal across the world. At the same time, it also contains some folklore catalogues. So we have the Bearskin analytical catalogue, where Bearskin, Yuri Bearskin has created a catalogue of about 3,200 motifs and sort of categorize them to certain myths, or myths are categorized to these motifs. And we have something called the ATU, the Arnold Thompson-Luther Index, which suggests different themes in myths. So we can use those. You can see how they're mapped across the world, and that is probably one of the key tools in understanding myth and motif dispersal. And you can, I'd say, with a pinch of salt, as I would say, you could look for motifs, see
Mhm.
its dispersal, and make some assumptions about actually perhaps where did that come from, depending on how it's dispersed. So if it's just in Europe, you consider it European. If you see a story, let's say there's a story uh, of who's a chap who played the lyre really well in Greek mythology? Um,
Is that Orpheus?
Orpheus, yes,
Or
Orpheus in the
okay.
underworld. So Orpheus in the underworld, yes, sorry about that. So his wife dies from a snake bite. He wants to
Uh-huh.
go and rescue her, and he goes down and will do this. Well, that story, almost identical, appears in indigenous American culture.
Hmm.
Okay, now how does that happen? And in fact, that story appears in Iran and Persia and India and all other places over Eurasia. Now, is that because everybody has coincidentally made it up? Or did that story pass across with humans as they migrated to America
Mhm.
15,000 years ago over the Bering Strait when that was sort of landmass and frozen. And probabilistically, we feel it must have migrated at 15,000 years. So we can look at the dispersal and sort of make some, is it worth looking at this myth or motif to see if it's worth investigating to being an old one? And there's many stories like that we haven't really touched on. And I'm not talking about the folklore database anymore. But we got many stories that are, we see in the Americas and Eurasia that could not, by their content, have been put there by Europeans migrating over there in the 1500s, 1600s, were not part of the more Sami or Inuit migrations 5,000 years ago. They must have almost certainly moved and migrated, dispersed, as you want, 15,000 years ago or before.
Mhm.
And that is absolutely fascinating that we have stories that persist like that. And the database will help you see some of these, and some of these are recognised. The cosmic hunt is one of those. Say Orpheus in the underworld is another one, but there are many others, and we've got many older stories as well. Stories of how humans used to marry. So we have a magic wife story, really popular across Eurasia and into the Americas, and it's about where men would go away to get their wife, bring them back, have children, and then send them away again, or they would
Right.
disappear. And they thought they
Interesting.
turned into a bird and flew off. Um, but there's all sorts of stories like that. And so the prime reason for the folklore database is to find narratives that contain things you want to find, to understand dispersals. And generally, if you're a storyteller or author, you want some ideas of storytelling. It's absolutely a gold mine of ideas for that.
All right, well, I'll have it linked in the description. John White, thank you very much for coming on the channel.
It's been an absolute pleasure. Thank you.